So I have been here for a couple months. I came from Texas, so this is why this is a little chilly for me this morning. I need a couple degrees more to be comfortable. And I am sort of covering in my extension all of the crops in South Dakota, and I'll be happy to answer questions you have at the end of the session. What I'll be talking to you about today are a couple important pests in corn, and then we'll move to one pest in soybeans that I sort of have a soft spot for. But before we go into the bugs and I show you some things, this event, this 2-day field school, is about IPM, and we throw this term IPM around a lot, but I think to really understand what it's about, we need to start saying things outright. So IPM stands for Integrated Pest Management, and the two words at the beginning, at the end of this acronym, are really important to take deep into heart if we're to do it right. So IPM is about managing pests. It's not about controlling pests. We don't want to live in a world that's free of insects in your field. That world is not sustainable, not possible to achieve, and it would be a sad, sad world for everybody if that was the case. And it's about integrating. So it's about integrating a bunch of different strategies to manage pests. We can't do this sustainably, we can't do it right, unless we integrate a whole bunch of strategies to manage pests. You can't rely on only one strategy to do it right. And there's an example I'll talk about in a little bit where we have relied on only one strategy, and now we're going to pay a very high price for that very soon. Before I go on, I wanted to tell you about our newsletter that we have started putting out at the end of April. How many of you are getting the SDSU Extension Crop and Pest newsletter? So I have a sign-up sheet here. If you would like to receive an email every week with a PDF of our newsletter, put your email down and we'll send it to you every week. And the newsletter is actually a team effort, and I'm very proud to be working with great people who are putting lots of time into this every week. We have entomology section, of course, that I especially like. Weeds section, plant diseases section. We have weather and climate update every week. So we put everything that we think is important for you to know every week about your health of your crop and what are the important things to know about. Every newsletter has some questions that I have for you. It's a big state and it's just a couple of us, so always appreciate hearing email or a phone call about important pest issues, insect pest issues in your area and your crop. Always welcome. So we also on Facebook these days, we have SDSU Extension Entomology Facebook page, if you like to communicate that way and get some images and information from there. So every newsletter has a little bit about IPM, because every newsletter has Predator of the Week. I include that, and I also include a lot of information. We all include a lot of information about the right time to start treating your pests. So IPM, Integrated Pest Management. Why do we care? Why should we try to integrate different strategies instead of going out on a scheduled calendar, figuring out what the pest is out, and mixing up some pesticide with your fungicide or herbicide and just spraying? Well, if we did just that, you might as well sprinkle that $2, shred it up and sprinkle it all over your field, because you're basically wasting it. If there is no reason to control a pest, if there is no pest out there, you're basically wasting money. So what are some important things that you have to do every time, every year you have to implement to do IPM successfully? The first and foremost, you have to be able to ID the pest. You have to get eye and eye with the bug, get to know it, respect its biology. We have to respect the bugs. They're pretty slick little creatures. They have us figured out way better than we probably have ourselves figured out. They can predict, whenever we do something on a schedule, or whenever we do something predictable, grow corn on corn on corn, or rotate corn and soybeans, they figure this out after some time, and they respond to that, okay? They're pretty slick. So what you need in order to get to know your bugs is this, which is the most important equipment of any entomology geek, and I think any good agronomist and pest manager and management person, anybody, hand lens, okay? How do you use a hand lens? You can't just grab your hand lens and stick it to the bug and try to get to see what's out there, okay? The way to do this, unfortunately, entomology is not for the most stylish of people. You have to take your cap out, whoa, and send the glasses flying too. You have to stand in the sun, so face the sun, get the hand lens straight to your eye, and then get close, further and closer to see what you're actually seeing on there until it comes in focus. All right, so ID the bug. You have to know what you're looking at to know what to do about it, okay, in your pest management strategies. Another thing that you have to know is that why is it important not to completely eliminate the bugs from your system? Why is it about control, management, and not control? You need some level of pest on the plant. Why? Because some small number of pests attract natural enemies, predators, the beneficial insects. So ladybugs, lacewings, parasitic wasps, teeny tiny little creatures, you don't even know they exist, but they do a world of good for you. And if you have them in your field, it's a great thing. So you need some pests in there to support those natural enemies and make sure that they stay in the field. If your field is void of everything, they will leave off, okay? There's also some research that shows that the plants know when they're being fed on, of course, and they put out they have some strategies to deal with the fact that there's some bugs on them. So the plant has some aphids, let's say, and it's all in a little freak out mode. There's something feeding on me, whoops, I have to put out more growth to compensate for that. So at certain level of number of insects, the plants are actually growing a little bit more to compensate for the damage, okay? So this is why we have to wait until the pest levels reach a certain threshold before we do something. It's a very important pest management strategy. So know your bug, don't spray on schedule, and stick to thresholds. So sort of integrating a whole bunch of different strategies. Another important strategy that's one of the most pivotal things, I think, in row crop management, insect management, is making sure you have good sanitation. Okay, so weeds, we're going to walk out a little bit into the soybean field out there. Weeds are a very important source of insects, okay? Lots of things overwinter in weeds, and when they first come into your fields, the pests start sort of where the weeds are. So keeping good sanitation of your fields is very important. And using resistant varieties of plants, there's a couple pests in wheat, actually, that we have some resistant varieties that we can use to make sure that you have less of a problem with pests, and Kelly is going to talk a little bit about that as well. Corn rootworm. Anyone has seen corn rootworms this year? Aplenty? Any fields failing? BT fields failing? Yep, it's happening. So what happens when we expose insects to the same sort of toxin year in and year out? It's in there. Okay, it's like when somebody pushes your buttons, okay? All you think about is pushing it back, right? So with all the chemistry that we have available to us, we're pushing the same, similar, or just a bunch of different buttons, but they're the same buttons, different types of chemicals, different formulations and trade names. It's just a couple different things that we keep pushing. And what insects do, they evolve resistance. It's sort of let's survive and get through it kind of a mentality, and they're pretty good at it because they've been doing this for quite some time, so they have a huge edge on us. So what's happening right now? We have completely relied on BT technology for rootworm management for years. What we're seeing now is what was inevitable. Whenever you depend on strictly chemical control, and it's one chemical type, year in, year out, you're going to have resistance, okay? So we're seeing it right now. So the BT3 have been confirmed failing in our area in Brookings and Moody County, and there's some other that are a little better, Herculex and Smart Stacks, but it's just a matter of time, okay? This is why IPM is the saving grace. This is the spray on schedule was how we did things, 30 years ago? And it backfires. It just always will. Okay, maybe you need to see it to believe it in your field, but it will happen. So corn rootworms. Have you ever scouted for larvae? Anyone here? So scouting for larvae is a bit of a pain. You have to dig out a square foot of soil, grab a black tarp and start digging through the roots and the soil to find the larvae. The larvae are small and they're cream colored, and here's some. I think they're mostly dead because they had a tough day yesterday too, but you can take a look here. So they're small, cream colored, and they do a number on your roots, okay? There's some research out of Minnesota that shows that the larvae removing one node of a plant reduces yield by 15%, okay? So this is not even severe damage. Here's an example of what you might see. Here's uninfested plant, okay? Healthy, strong root. And here's one that's been infested by rootworms, okay? I can pass that on too. That's pretty severe. So you have reduction in yield because they're feeding on the plant. But then what you see, of course, is that, you know, the telltale goosenecking of the plants. And then if it does anything in South Dakota, it blows, the wind will come and just push those plants down, and you can't harvest it. So pretty big deal. In our newsletter a couple weeks ago, we were writing about the adults because we have only one generation of rootworms here in our area. Southerners have it much worse. Our people in the east, they have the southern rootworms, which have multiple generations. We have only one in this area. So what they're doing right now is emerging, mating, and laying eggs. So guess what? If you had corn on corn, and you're going to have corn in the same field, okay, this is going to be a huge problem. So next year or two will be Armageddon years, basically. So a couple weeks ago, we were writing in our newsletter about the damage that the adults can do to corn silks. So the adults emerge and it will feed on the silks. If the silks are still green and they're shorter than ½ an inch, you need to do something about the beetles. But I think we're all past that point, right? So we still have to worry about the adults now because they are laying eggs. And in order to make management decision, you have to actually know a little bit about their morphology and biology. So you need to be able to tell females from males. It's easy, fortunately. The males are mostly black. Their elytra, the sclerotized hind wings, are mostly black. They have just a little bit of a yellowish blotch maybe at the back of the wings. And the females have more distinct stripes, okay? So they're going down the back and they're stripy. There's a mixture of males and females in there. So you need to be able to tell males and females. And you need to be able to tell when the females are gravid, when they're pregnant, when their abdomens are full of eggs. They're going to swell up. They're going to be yellow. And when you squeeze their abdomens, you'll see the eggs coming out. So before you learn how to tell a gravid female by sight, I recommend squeezing a couple and just confirming there's eggs coming out. So you need to know if they're pregnant, if they're gravid, because the treatment threshold is 0.75 of a beetle per plant and 10% of the females gravid, okay? So that's the threshold to do something in the field to try to manage their numbers and mitigate the damage.
Fly?
Like, how far? Oh, they fly. They can fly.
Like to different fields?
Yep, they will. They will move on between fields. They're very skittish. When you come close, they will just, you know, easily leave off, and they're pretty skittish and good flyers. Yeah, so corn rootworm is a very good example of how we actually shot ourselves in our feet, basically, by relying on just one management strategy, just the BT. We're going to have to go back to our industry partners, other researchers. You know, we're going to have to go back to the drawing board with this thing, because we have actually completely changed the distribution. So the population, we used to have more northern rootworms. What you have right there, the stripy one, is the western. These guys here I'm passing around, the green ones are the northern. So we used to have mostly northern in this area, but they're gone. We have completely, well, not completely, but they're mostly gone, and the westerns have displaced them. You know, it's a bug world, and they're competing against each other too. So, you know, the westerns are much better at at dealing with BT, and they've totally taken over.
So are the westerns responsible for extended diapause, or is it still the northerns?
So I think it's the northern that have the extended diapause, but the westerns can deal with our soybean rotation now too. So this is why you have to respect the bug. I mean, they will figure us out, okay, sooner or later. So the more crop rotation you use, and the more sort of natural habitat you keep around the fields, and sort of try to keep this a healthier system. If you look at our ag production, it's miles and miles and miles of the same thing, monocrop. It's very good for pests, okay, and very bad for natural enemies. So there's something to think about.
In your opinion, is refuge in the bag too late now?
Yeah, it's too late. So, you know, that's the thing too. We need to do a better job at letting people know how important it is to keep, to manage resistance better, because nobody was doing the refuge, and I can't say nobody, but I think many people were not doing it properly, and just sort of, well, who cares about that crop? It's going to be lost anyway. So it's a very important management strategy for managing resistance, and we have to get serious about this. We do. Any questions about this before I move on to smaller, better things? So I did my PhD actually on spider mites. I worked on neonic pesticides, so imidacloprid, thiamethoxam, gaucho, and you might know them as gaucho and poncho and cruiser. And I worked on their effect on spider mites actually. So spider mites are dear and close to my heart. And this year, like no other year, is the year for the spider mite. So corn and soybean, have you guys had issues with spider mites in your fields? Yeah?
Talk about it, yeah.
Talk about it. Well, you should start actually going out and scouting your plants. I bet you anything you have them, or you will have them. Spider mites are not, they're not insects, they're arachnids, and they're teeny tiny things that, they're sort of like, like daddy longlegs have one body part, so it's just like a little bead with 8 legs. So here's an image of a spider mite. They're tiny. They're, I think, in millimeters, and I think they're smaller than 1 millimeter. So you definitely need your hand lens before you become familiar with them, and this might be your year for becoming familiar with spider mites. They feed by, they have little stylets because they're arachnids, so they puncture the individual cells of the plant and they suck out the chlorophyll, so you will see little stippling damage. And when their populations increase, the stippling damage will coalesce into greater areas, and then in very high numbers they will cause this browning of the leaves and leaf drop actually. So there is a table that people from Texas A&M came up with that includes sort of like calculation of a threshold where you should do something about spider mites, and it includes going out in the field and recording percentage of your plants that have spider mite damage, and then looking at every leaf and recording percentage of that leaf that's damaged. Well, that's, I know how this works, I don't know how many people are out there and doing such a complex scouting protocol. So somebody from Colorado actually came up with a simpler scheme. If you see spider mite damage on the lower third of corn plants, and if there's evidence of spider mite colonies on the middle third of the plants, it's time to treat for spider mites. So what does the damage look like here? This is basically a very heavy spider mite damage, so you can see little stippling on the plant, and then you can see spider mites and you can see webbing. Spider mites got their name because just like spiders in high numbers, they produce webbing. They use that webbing to lay eggs in between, and then they use the little silks to transport themselves by wind to another plant. Okay, so take a look at that, and again, face the sun if you're going to use your loop, and get this straight to your eye, very close, and I would remove the hat too and check it out. Okay, this is very heavy, and you can see them without a lens even. They're super abundant there. Let me find something else here. This one's good too. Nothing much is happening with this corn this year, so this is no wasted. Yep, they're right over here.
So at this stage, it still would pay to
Oh,
if you had.
So past hard dough stage, there's no point to no, not at all. This is more of a learning thing here now. So usually you will not see spider mites on corn, heavy on corn, except for a year like this. Spider mites are susceptible to a lot of fungi that attack them, so they keep them under check in the regular year. In a year like this year, you know, it's totally different. So can you see them okay? They're tiny. They are. It takes some looking to see them. They're cool though. They're pretty neat.
So
they have
like that treatment. This wouldn't be a treatment level here, right?
Oh, it would. Yeah.
It would?
If it was before hard dough stage, it would be. So these things have multiple generations a year. They pop eggs like there's no tomorrow. The female can pop, 100 eggs. They take, in a hot, dry season, they can take as little as 10 days to be ready to finish developing and start popping eggs. So they
So if you find any on the lower leaves.
So if third of the canopy has damage, and then you see some colonies on the middle third, then it's time to do something. So we can move to soybeans for a sec. So scouting for spider mites is one of those things that you can drive through in your pickup on the edge of your field and figure out if you need to get out of your truck and check for spider mites. Spider mites start sort of at the edge of the field. The weeds that you can see here, this is a very bad IPM practice. Weedy areas in your field. I think there's volunteer corn someplace in there. I think I saw it the other day. So not a good IPM practice. Your fields have to be clean, because weeds are a source of many pests, and they're definitely a source of spider mites. Okay, so the infestations will start at the edge of your field, and you will see. So this is pretty severe. This is pretty severe spider mite damage. I'm going to send that around. There's some disease in there too. But the leaves are starting to completely get sort of bleached out, get this yellowy and then browning appearance, and then they drop from the plants. So if you see that at the lower canopy, and then the spider mite colonies are progressing up through the beans, okay, and then you see some stippling, but it's not as heavy. There's tons of them here too, actually. Yep. Then it's a good time. That's a good rule of thumb to do something about to apply some treatments. So miticides are very expensive. So spot treating spider mite infestation is a good practice. They will start at the edge of your field. If you catch them before they get too bad, just spot treat the edges. When you get out more in the field, their numbers will be lower, and there's a bunch of natural enemies of spider mites that will take care of them very, very nicely. There's predatory thrips that are ferocious predators of these things, lacewings. So there's a ton, minute pirate bugs actually too. There are a ton of natural enemies out there that will take care of a smaller population of spider mites. So spot treating is a good practice too.
So they'll be on both sides of the leaf?
So they start, when their numbers are low, they will start on the underside of the leaf. But when they increase, they will be on both sides. So if you see them on the upper side, it's a large colony.
Did you just say spot treating is recommended?
Yeah. You don't have to spray the entire field. No.
You could do around the ends.
If you have them around yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then this is, miticides are expensive, so that's a better use of money. So one important thing, whenever you make pesticide treatments for spider mites, pyrethroids, with the exception of bifenthrin, are known to flare spider mites. So avoid pyrethroids except for bifenthrin. That's the only one that does not.
When you first scout, do you pull a plant out or just grab a leaf?
Oh no, yeah.
Talk about shaking on a white paper.
Yep. So no need to pull the plant out, and shaking it over a piece of paper is good. If you don't have a hand lens with you, you forgot it unfortunately, you can just take a leaf and beat it against a piece of paper, and you'll see little tiny specks running around. Those are spider mites.
We've seen a lot of other little black things. So what else is out there?
Little black things. That's my favorite question. I have this little black thing, and what is it? Okay. So thrips are, there are thrips that are black, but they're tiny little spindly looking insects. Lots of thrips. Some black, yeah, there's a black. I forgot the species of the black one. Is it? I don't remember what that one is. But yeah, a lot of thrips are predatory as well as herbivorous. So thrips are like Kelly's going to talk a little bit about them. They're like a double-edged sword. They help us a little, they harm us a little. So, but yeah. Spider mites will be teeny tiny specks. Any other questions?
How about preventative? Is it a good idea at a certain level just to go ahead and border the fields?
I would not recommend it. No, I would not. So preventative is not something that, in terms of pesticide treatments, is not something that sits very well with IPM practice, because if there's nothing there, what you're going to do is kill some beneficial insects.
So you just sit and wait till threshold.
Yes, yes, yes.
Will ladybugs eat mites? I can't remember.
So there is a very cool little ladybug, teeny tiny. It's like a pinhead size. It's called Stethurus. They call them, the common name is spider mite destroyer. And it's this little tiny beetle, lady beetle, that feeds strictly on spider mites, and it's a really cool thing, but it's teeny tiny and black.
We have it in South Dakota?
Yeah, yeah.
So you can't really see it.
You can, but you'd have to know who you're looking. So maybe I'll put that in the newsletter next week, because it's a cool one actually. And they have very dramatic names, you know, spider mite destroyer, or minute pirate bugs, and yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, we can talk at the end, but I'm going to turn it over to Kelly now.
I've been the soybean entomologist at SDSU for about 7 years now, and I certainly see some familiar faces in the crowd, folks that I've known before, met before at other programs, so welcome. And if you've heard me talk at other programs, you've heard me talk a lot about the #1 pest of soybeans in South Dakota, which is soybean aphid, and maybe you're as bored of hearing me talk about soybean aphid thresholds as I sometimes get talking about it. So this year, soybean aphid is not really a big deal for us, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some other insect pests that are much more of an issue this year for soybean, although across the board I'd say the drought is really kicking our butts a lot more on soybean than any insect pests. So one of the new, for me, pests that we're seeing in soybean sporadically, it's not anywhere near what I'd call an epidemic, but I've been getting some calls, and some of our neighboring states have also been finding soybean thrips at damaging levels. This was a new one for me. I've always seen the thrips in the soybean. I've always found them. You've probably seen them too when you're scouting for insects in soybean. But this year there are actually some fields around the region experiencing damaging levels of soybean thrips. Soybean thrips are a little bit smaller than soybean aphids, and they're sort of range from pale yellow to orange in color, and they're real long and skinny. They're just real long, skinny minis that tend to have a feeding damage that looks something like spider mite, because they feed in a similar way. They scrape off cells, suck out cell contents. Unlike spider mites, their feeding damage will be a little bit more linear, like they'll go along in a trench, where spider mites you'll see more dots. But that's a pretty subtle difference that's hard to pick up on. You often find thrips where you find spider mites, because A, they're favored by the same kind of conditions, the warm, dry conditions, and also, as Ada mentioned, some of them will opportunistically also feed on spider mites. I have not done trials with soybean thrips in South Dakota. It's never been anything more than a, oh, I see a thrip now and then kind of thing. But for thresholds, I've been relying on advice from my colleague at Purdue University, Christian Krupke, and he recommends a threshold, action threshold for thrips of about 8 thrips per leaf, and feeding damage in evidence. This is something you're not likely to run across most years. This year it's a possibility, so that's something kind of new and different to keep your eye on. And in next week's extension newsletter, I will put in a little article about thrips with some picture to help you with identification, and also a list of products that are labeled for thrips and soybean. Grasshoppers, that's the other insect pest that is an occasional sporadic problem in soybean that most years not a big deal in most locations, but we're seeing more grasshopper activity this year than typical, also because of the hot, dry conditions which favor grasshoppers. This is another edge pest. Like spider mite, they usually start on field edges when they're coming in from other places, especially weeds or shelter belts. So when you start to see the shot holes along the edges, that is time when it starts. That is when it's time to start looking a little bit harder for the grasshoppers. There are thresholds that can be used with grasshoppers and soybean based on counting grasshoppers. I actually find that a little bit hard to do. Grasshoppers are real mobile, not real easy to count. And then the other factor layered in there is you often have other things that are chewing on the soybeans too. Maybe you've got grasshoppers chewing some holes, but maybe you've also got a little bit of bean leaf beetle. Maybe you've got a little bit of clover worm. Just a little bit of this and that all doing the chewing. So I actually, for chewing insects, I prefer to go with a general action threshold based on how much defoliation has happened with the plants. Rather than trying to count a particular chewing insect, look at the overall amount of damage. Treating on field edges is a good way to stop a growing grasshopper population, but once they get going in a field and you want to treat the field as a whole, a good guideline for when is a good time to treat. If you have during the flowering or the pod stages of soybean, if you've got 20 to 25% defoliation, that's just of all the chewing insects, that's a good time to consider treatment. And it can be a little bit tough to gauge percent defoliation. You know, what does 25% holes look like? There are some good guides that all you have to do is Google soybean defoliation and you'll come up with 10 templates that show you the holes in the soybean leaves. I will also put a defoliation guide in next week's newsletter that you can print out and use as kind of a visual guideline of, oh, this is what 20% damage looks like. And that's kind of plant-wide. You don't want to just say, well, this top trifoliate has 20% damage. You want to try to evaluate more or less the whole plant on that. A lot of you have heard me talk a lot about soybean aphid thresholds, and I'm going to try your patience with just a few more comments about that this year because I've been getting a lot of questions. This is something that people are talking about. Well, that action threshold of 250 aphids per plant was fine when we had lower bean values, but what about now? Beans are at $15, maybe even almost $16 sometimes. How does that affect my treatment threshold for soybean aphids? Shouldn't it be lower because the bean value is higher? Now, there's a kernel of truth in the idea that things do change with the crop values. But for reasons I'm going to explain in a little more detail, 250 is still a pretty decent working number to work with. And that's because 250 aphids per plant is not actually the damage level. We call that, the term is an economic threshold. But I don't really like that term because it implies that that's where the economic borderline is, where you start experiencing economic loss. And that's misleading because that's not really what an economic threshold is. I much prefer the term action threshold because the action threshold is where you want to take action before the population gets to the economically damaging level. When bean prices were lower, the economically damaging level or the economic injury level, where the value of the beans that you're losing about equals your treatment cost, used to be, we had on average 650 aphids per plant. But it makes sense if you're losing a bushel of beans at $15, you're losing more than if you lose a bushel at $6. So in fact, the economic injury level does vary with the commodity value. We can redo the calculations based on, we have a pretty good sense of how many aphids causes how much damage. And we've recalculated the economic injury level for a $15 a bushel bean price and using just an average $6 an acre treatment cost, which includes various aspects of treatment, not just the cost of the product. Doing that recalculation, a new economic injury level based on these values is not exactly, but pretty close to 450 aphids per plant. So that's about where the treatment cost justifies the yield you're saving. So what does that mean for your action threshold or your decision point? Well, before, when we had a 650 aphid per plant economic injury level, we said that that gave you about a 7-day lead time from your decision point at 250 to line up treatment before the aphids can be expected to reach 650. Of course, the aphids are going to reach 450 before they reach 650. That gives you less lead time. So you can still use 250 aphids per plant as a guideline if you think you can line up treatment within 4 days. That gives you 4 days of lead time to line up treatment before your population can be expected to cross that boundary. So 4 days, when it's a busy aphid time and the plains are busy, maybe that doesn't sound like quite enough time to be sure. You know, I'm willing to admit using a threshold of 200 aphids per plant is not going to be the end of the world. It gives you that little bit of extra time if you feel you need it. But I would particularly, if you're going to lower your action threshold a little bit, I would do that in situations where you know that aphid population is rising. You can see it climbing on you. That's not happening this year. This year is, well, I'll tell you what I've seen, then, and I'll ask you guys what you've seen. I cover a lot of fields that I scout regularly to keep an eye on aphid populations, and I'm finding, just about no activity. I mean, you can find a few aphids here or there, but you guys collectively cover a lot more acreage probably than I do. So what are you all seeing for soybean aphids this year?
Yeah, hot spots.
The occasional hot spot. What's the most you've seen?
Seen the top part of the stem covered with them.
Recently or a little earlier?
Yeah.
Okay, what part?
This week, actually.
Whereabouts?
No, southwest Minnesota.
Okay, so yeah, never want to tell people to stop scouting, but I would say across the board this is like the lowest aphid year I've probably seen since I came to South Dakota 7 years ago. So
Walk out in the field and you won't see a thing.
got to look for them.
Just hot spots.
Yeah. And this is the time of year when they start to pick up, end of July. They usually start to build and then peak somewhere around the middle or third week of August. So I would never tell people don't worry about it, but I would say this is a year where we've got to probably worry a little bit less about things getting out of control than other years. But really back to the message is there's not a lot of point in making a treatment decision below 200 aphids per plant, because the chances are just as even that they're gonna hang around there or even go down as they are to go up. And especially a year like this where it's hot and dry, if you put down a pyrethroid, you're really going to risk flaring up the spider mites. That's a much bigger concern for me this year than aphids. And another thing to keep in mind is there's another concept, the damage boundary, which is regardless of the crop value. How many insects does it even take for us to detect yield loss? You could do a calculation where you could prove that you couldn't tolerate a single aphid on a plant, but you're not going to see yield loss with 1 aphid per plant or 5 aphids per plant. You're not even going to be able to detect yield loss with 100 aphids per plant or more. They're just not doing that much to the plant that you're going to see it come out in yield. So when you drop your threshold down too far, what you're really doing is just ignoring the fact that there's not enough there to damage, and there's a very unsure likelihood at a low level that it's ever going to get to the economic entry level. I've done a lot of trials under a lot of different conditions in South Dakota, and the lowest aphid population where I've been able to detect in my replicated trials, been able to detect yield loss is about 400 aphids per plant. So just keep in mind that there is a certain value in recognizing where your plants are actually even going to be hurting or not. Any questions?
Since we haven't had much experience with the spider mites, what is the potential yield loss on them at levels that we see for treatment? Is there 7 bushel losses, or I don't know what to expect with spider mites?
Yeah, you know, that's a good question. I haven't done enough work. It's been such a sporadic problem in the state to give you a good value of X spider mites equals X amount of yield damage. The rule of thumb that we use for when it's valuable to treat is similar for corn. You've got mites and damage present in the lower canopy, and then the mites have started to colonize the middle canopy. And we recommend that that's a time to go ahead and treat. Spider mites can get away from you real fast because of their reproductive potential, and when the weather's right, they can pop on you, particularly when it's warm and dry. So that's the general guideline, and I can't tie it to X number of mites equals X number of bushels the way I could do that pretty well with aphids. But
So if you find them on the top leaves like these beans, then that's pretty bad.
I think it's time to spray. Yeah, once you start finding them in the middle canopy, that's about when you want to take action, and definitely when you start seeing them in the top. It's particularly, I'm a little concerned if we keep on with this type of weather through August. Usually it's not till middle of August when we do see spider mite problems. It's usually not till the middle of August anyway. And given that we're starting to see it at the end of July, this is definitely a year to be alert about that.
So if you treat them once, like let's say you sprayed now, like in 2 weeks, they could come back.
You want to go back. A lot of the products like Lorsban don't kill the eggs, so I would recommend going back out in 5 days and then see if the eggs that didn't get killed have hatched. And it's often necessary when you got a real good population going to do a second treatment and use a different product. So you might start with Lorsban and then switch to dimethoate, and that's a duo that some people use. The residuals of both of those are going to be a little bit lower when it's hot like this, so that's another reason to be alert. But I would definitely recommend scouting a minimum of 5 days after your first treatment, because a lot of those products will not knock out the eggs. So, and there are other miticides available. They can sometimes be a little bit hard to find, actually, and they can be pretty pricey. Ada's actually done a fair amount of work with spider mites in cotton in Texas, and so we're very lucky to have a spider mite
I'm sorry, it's a little chilly
expert.
So
She's trying to warm in the sun. She's 4 months out of Texas, and she still thinks we're in winter here. So
I need mid-70s. But actually, so I wanted to mention, I don't think any extension group, university group has actually looked at the potential for spider mites to decrease yield in soybeans, because I don't think they're a very common problem in the Midwest, and so I don't think, like, we don't even have hard, solid thresholds. This middle, this bottom canopy and middle canopy is very ballparky kind of, because we don't have thresholds established, because they're usually not a problem, and the plants can take quite a hit from them in a regular year anyway. So this is a very unusual year. It's story number 50 out of this unusual year kind of.
Some of the best information we have is there was a big spider mite problem in the late 80s. And our colleague Ken Osley at Minnesota got himself out there real fast and did some trials to look at yield loss, and he based on where the mites were in the plant and sort of how abundant they were at what tier of the plant, and that's the information we're still using to this day as our best guideline we can give you. They're damn hard to count though, so that's not something, I mean, when we want to count them, we've got these mite brushes and we take them into the lab and we use a scope and all that, and that's not something producers are going to do. So it's just not something that's practical for most people to do in the field. They're just so small. Dark paper, I find if you're doing the tap test, a piece of black construction paper actually works better for CM than a white paper. It's something about the black, kind of they show up, contrast better against the black, so I often keep a piece of black construction paper on my clipboard if I want to look for mites. Okay, the last thing I'm going to talk about briefly is aphid-resistant soybean varieties. I've been talking about this off and on for several years because I think it's a really good IPM tool, but I'm sort of surprised at the degree to which they haven't really taken off. How many of you or the clients you work with have dabbled with aphid-resistant soybean varieties? A couple folks. These are, most of the commercial varieties that have been coming out over the past few years are based on RAG1, which is a single gene source of resistance to aphids. This is not a GMO technology. This is a naturally occurring gene that's been bred into soybean lines for the region. And these can actually save your bacon on the right type of aphid year with very heavy aphid pressure. And I know we're all still a little sleepy and you don't want to look at a lot of data, but I do want to show you one chart that I think illustrates how these can be a useful part of IPM. Thanks, Jonathan. One of the things that disappoints some people who try them is that they're not aphid free. I think our expectations for resistance are a little bit twisted by our history with BT, and we think, well, there's just not going to be this insect in the field if we've got resistance. Used to be, there was an understanding that resistance was not an absolute thing, but a relative thing. And I think maybe we need to get back to that concept, particularly with these aphid-resistant varieties. So you can get aphids, especially in a bad aphid year, but there'll be a lot less than in the susceptible varieties. So this is a trial we did a few years ago in Aurora near Brookings, and a picture's worth 1,000 words. This was a very heavy aphid year where we had up to 7,000 aphids per plant on our susceptible varieties, and we peaked at about 2,000 aphids per plant, which is still a lot, on our resistant varieties. But 2,000 is not 7,000, and that's true from the plant's perspective too. This is the pods pulled off of one plant under this heavy aphid pressure, the resistant variety, and the pods pulled off of the susceptible variety under this aphid onslaught. So that's a pretty big difference. This is maybe not as good as it could have been if there hadn't been all those aphids, but it's a lot better than this. We can also see this in the yield data that we took from these plots. So soybean aphid resistant varieties here on these two bars. The black bar is resistant varieties that we treated with insecticide to keep all the aphids off. And this is the yield at about 40 bushel. This is the yield off of resistant varieties that we didn't treat. We just let the aphids have their way. And there's a little bit less yield there. It's not statistically different. If I'd had one more rep, I bet it would have been. There is a little bit of a yield loss there when we didn't treat the resistant beans, but it's pretty good, pretty close to the treated one. Whereas contrast that with the yield on the susceptible soybeans. On the susceptible soybeans that were treated and kept aphid free, we got just about as good yield as we did on the treated resistant beans. So you might say, well, why should I even bother if I'm going to treat both of these to get maximum yield? But look what happened to the yield on the susceptible soybeans that didn't get treated at all. We're somewhere down around 25 bushel on that. Compare that untreated treatment, these are the untreated susceptible, to the untreated resistant beans. There's a big difference between the yield on those two. Some people kind of avoid, I think, using the resistant varieties because they feel like they don't yield quite as well, and they're also disappointed that they're not aphid free. But I would argue that this is yielding an awful lot better than this in a year where they were getting pounded with aphids, and this is yielding about as well as the susceptible variety that both were treated. So I consider it a pretty good hedge. I think the yield drag has more to do with the genetics that these beans, that these resistance traits happen to have been offered in. I have seen certain plant genetics that have the RAG1 gene that yield just fine. But even if you do have one that doesn't yield quite as well, let's say it's a crazy aphid year like this where there's 7,000 aphids per plant and all the planes are tied up and maybe it rains and you can't get into the field to treat on the ground. I consider this a pretty good hedge against that type of situation, and a pretty good alternate strategy. So it might not be what you want to base your entire production system on, but as part of an integrated pest management system, I think it has a good solid place as a part of the picture. And in a moderate aphid year, this is the really good part. This is a crazy aphid year. In a moderate aphid year, very often we will see these resistant varieties never reach the point where they have to be treated at all, whereas a lot of the susceptible ones do. So in a crazy year, it's that added layer of protection, and in a moderate year, many years you may not have to treat them at all.
Do you have any data on seed treatments of insecticide from last year?
We've been working last year and this year a lot with the seed treatments. Thanks, Jonathan. We have not seen, we see earlier in the season, we'll see lower aphid populations on the seed treated, but by the time we get to the end of the season, by the time we get to the middle of August, that difference has more or less equaled out. The seed treatments wear off after a certain amount of time, and we get our big aphid colonization events are usually towards the end of July, beginning of August. We get these large winged aphid migrations recolonizing a lot of fields from places where they've built up. And that's why we usually see our big aphid peak at the middle of August, because they kind of go onto the wind at the beginning of August and spread around. And by that time, the seed treatments are gone. We have not seen the seed treatments turn into a yield benefit when there's a lot of aphids. And we may see a little bit less aphids on the seed treatments, but not enough to really justify the cost of the treatment. We are doing leaf assays this year where we take leaves every week and put them in the freezer, and we're going to get the assays done to look at the titer of the product in the plant over time so that we can pinpoint when we actually stop detecting it. But we definitely stop seeing any aphid suppression effect in the field certainly by the end of July. So this is not something I really recommend at all as a year in, year out protection mechanism for aphids, because there's other effects of it too. I mean, it's just like we see problems in corn because we've put Bt in there that's on every year on everything. It's always expressed, it's always there. We can run into very similar resistance problems when we do the same thing with seed treatments. It's just the same thing as going out and spraying every week. It's the same, biologically the same effect. Bean leaf beetle, that is one area where I would say seed treatment can have some value as part of an IPM program, particularly early season bean leaf beetles. If you're in a place and you have a field where just consistently, you know, it always gets hammered with bean leaf beetles early in the season, I have seen good management from seed treatments like Cruiser early in the season from bean leaf beetle. But so many people just don't have that consistent problem with bean leaf beetle that I would not recommend it as just a general never worry about bean leaf beetle approach, because most people honestly don't have to worry that often about bean leaf beetle anyway. Or if they do, it's maybe 1 year in 5. And does that mean you should put down the treatment every single year? Probably not. But some folks do, particularly if you've got a lot of alfalfa around the fields, around your soybean. Those tend to get hit harder and worse with bean leaf beetle, because the adult bean leaf beetles will hang out in the alfalfa as soon as it starts coming up and then move into the beans. So if you do have a kind of dependable bean leaf beetle problem area, seed treatments can be useful.
Are aphids attracted to certain fields more than others? Like you talked about recolonizing. Is that a...
That's a real good question, and there's sort of this lore that, you know, like fields that are a little more yellow will be, you know, a little more attractive, and I'm not saying there's not something to that, but I've never been able to, you know, really quantify it in a scientific way. There definitely are varieties that are more favorable and pleasing to aphids than others, just because of natural variation. In fact, there was a line that we always used for our susceptible checks. It was from Syngenta S19R5, and we nicknamed it aphid candy because they just really liked it. And then I found out, we started being able to not get it, and I found out that they took it off the market because it was, well, because aphids really liked it. So there is that variation there. Also, nutrient profiles can affect aphid populations. There's a lot of variables. Moisture stress or lack of can affect aphid populations. I've actually been interested to find out more about the color thing, because you do get these aphids that are up on the air column, and they've got to decide at a certain time when to come down and when to land in the fields. And you know, color, who's to say that's not a cue they're using? I think there's might be, well, something to that, but it's just nothing we've been able to get a handle on.
If you spray one field and the neighbor doesn't, I mean, is it, once they're sprayed though, they can't move, right?
What's that?
They wouldn't move onto a neighbor's field that wasn't sprayed, right?
When so they go through several generations in a year, and some of those generations are wingless and they're not going anywhere, but they then, when conditions become stressful, they will start producing winged offspring. So there'll be a trigger in there where their next round of offspring will be winged, and then those will disperse. So you often see that when they start getting crowded in a field, and you know, they don't like to be crowded and they're competing against one another, so they will start producing winged offspring that will then migrate to other places in the field or other fields. And that's what usually happens at the end of July. There's certain fields that were colonized early. Maybe they were close to buckthorn, which is the plant that is the overwintering habitat in a lot of weed shelter belts and woodlots. So they'll build up in certain fields. They'll go get crowded, say it's time to move on. They'll go up on the air column, and they'll start to go into these migrating modes. That's usually towards the end of July, after they've started building up locally. So if you just have a field that's full of mostly non-winged aphids and you spray, they're not going anywhere. But if something's going on in that field that's stressing them out, then they are perfectly capable of moving on, at least in next generations.
Seems like 2 years ago here, when somebody was talking about aphids from SDSU, he was kind of questioning really if they migrate from the buckthorn. He said, you know, it's a host, but he said more, he doesn't really go into the buckthorn in the spring and really doesn't find them coming out of there. He's thinking more it was the winds, or you know,
they definitely overwinter on buckthorn. They have to have that plant to spend the winter on, and in the fall, that's what they look for.
From the south somewhere.
They don't come from the south. We send them down to the south because they don't have buckthorn in the south. The basic rule is south of I-80, you just don't really have buckthorn. So we are the manufacturers and the exporters in this part of the world for soybean aphids. And my colleague Brian McCormick in Kansas, they can get soybean aphid outbreaks in Kansas, but it's only under certain conditions where they've built up to high levels up in Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, and then a good north wind comes and blows them down at the right time. So their infestations down there very much depend on wind patterns and what's been happening the rest of the season up here. They definitely overwinter in buckthorn, and they definitely, just my experience is, the fields that you see first infested in the early summer are the ones that are close to some source of buckthorn. And whenever I'm planting my trials, I have these on our various SDSU research farms. There's some of them that have woodlots with buckthorn, and so I very jealously guard those field sites as mine, because those are the ones where I can more reliably count on getting the aphid infestations. So some people will poo-poo that idea because it can be a little bit hard to find them in buckthorn, like you really have to look real hard, but that is the manufacture site. And I always tell people earlier in the season, you're not interested in looking at all the beans, but look at the ones first that are near any kind of woodlot or shelter belt, particularly if you know there's buckthorn in there.
Did you find a lot of aphids this spring on buckthorn?
No. And we had such a mild winter, I sort of thought, oh, this could be an interesting aphid year, but I couldn't find them. I always go out in the spring and kind of do a circuit and look for buckthorn. It can be a little bit hard to correlate what you find in buckthorn at the beginning of the season with what happens later, because so much of what happens depend on summertime conditions. The weather plays into it a lot, the plant conditions. They do not do particularly well in hot, dry conditions. Once it starts getting above 90, their reproduction slows way down. This has been such a hot summer. I mean, they're just not doing real well this summer. Spider mites, completely different story, of course. But the eggs of in the fall you can find the eggs. The aphids will only have eggs one time a year, and that's in the fall when they're laying their eggs on the buckthorn. The rest of the year they're just reproducing by live birth of aphids that look pretty much like them. But in the fall they'll lay their eggs that look like little black jelly beans, and they'll work them under the buds of the buckthorn. And you can see these little black jelly beans under there. They're kind of neat, actually. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned plant nutrition. Could you tell us more about how aphid populations are affected by the nutrients, especially potassium?
Potassium is kind of the driver for the one that's been studied most for aphid populations, and low potassium seems to be favorable for aphids. And nitrogen not as much. Potassium seems to be potassium deficient, will encourage aphids.
Is there any idea of a threshold level?
We haven't worked that kind of soil guidelines out, although Deirdre Prishman, who's an entomologist at North Dakota State University, is very interested in soil chemistry and how it relates to pest populations. So she's working on a grant right now looking at soil properties and how they affect aphids. So hopefully we'll have a little bit more detailed information for people from that work.
So a healthy plant would retard like even mites and aphids?
A healthy plant's always going to be in a better condition to withstand the damage. As to whether how much your population's going to build up on a healthy plant versus a not healthy plant, I guess it's safe to say it's generally, as a rule of thumb, easier for insects to overcome unhealthy plants. But I think it's a combination not just of insect buildup, but also the plant's ability to tolerate that damage. So when we've got fields like this where things are really on the line in terms of moisture stress, and that's a question a lot of people have asked: should I lower my thresholds because my plants are stressed? And maybe that's all I can say. It's we don't have necessarily thresholds that are developed under individual environmental conditions. I can say that the soybean aphid thresholds are built on 19 different yield loss studies under a very wide range of conditions, including moisture stress. So we feel pretty solid on those, even under moisture stress conditions. But honestly, in most insect systems, it's not intensively enough studied to be able to say, well, if your plants are at this crop condition, do it a little bit different this way. So there's a kind of common sense element of it too. We'd like to be super scientific in all the advice we give, but sometimes it's just do the best you can. Really, the bottom line is, I mean, we can talk about all the details of when to spray and what, but the big message is to consider the damage boundary of what you're looking at and think, do I really have enough here that this is going to show up in yield loss? And is my population really increasing to the point where I think I'll get to that point? And just making that decision based on the population and whether it's increasing or not, rather than just spraying because it's there. At the end of the day, that's the most important part. we could argue about 250 or 200 or, you know, whatever. Just the meta message is just, you know, use a little common sense about what's really a problem or what's going to cause you more problems. Particularly this year, I think preventative sprays is just a bad idea because of the potential for other pest outbreaks to follow it.
South Dakota's kind of been having a really good year with, well, not this year, but having some really good years with alfalfa production. We've kind of been climbing the ranks these last few years. 4 years ago, we were kind of holding the 4th place in national production, then we broke into 3rd, and we've really been going between 2nd and 3rd as far as national production, and just this last year, we broke into 1st. We're the highest producer of alfalfa in the nation. We grossed over $400 million off of that crop last year, which is awesome. It's a really good place to be for the state. But where we kind of run into some trouble here is that, you know, that's great, we're #1, but when you look at it closely, we're still losing about 30% of our yield every year. So we lose 30% of that, and we're still the #1 producer of alfalfa in the country, which is kind of crazy. Most other states, especially going further east, they're averaging about 5, maybe 10% yield loss in really bad years. And what's kind of attributing to that is just the amount of alfalfa weevil problems that we have here in the state. The alfalfa weevil is by far the most difficult pest and hardest pest, well, most damaging pest in alfalfa, followed closely by the potato leafhopper and grasshoppers later in the season. But where it gets us with these alfalfa weevils is there's kind of a lot of guesswork with it. When are they going to emerge? When they emerge, when do I spray? And even just looking at the weevil itself, there's a lot of kind of mystery about this eastern or western alfalfa weevil. Have anyone heard those terms being used, eastern and western alfalfa weevil? Well, it's the same insect, completely same species, they look the same. The only thing that differs is there's slightly different oviposition or egg-laying behavior that occurs between two. Now, the eastern or western behaviors, the eastern behavior, because their growing season's a little more extended, you see oviposition occurring in the late fall and then again in the spring. Well, the western behavior here that we have, because of our growing season being just shorter, we really only see that oviposition occurring in the spring. That in particular offers a great window of opportunity for us to get some really good management on the pest before it gets really out of control for us. If we know that we have this western behavior and they're only going to be laying eggs in the spring, we can wait for those adults to emerge and just hit them really hard. Just get out some different applications and or just use some different management practices to really drive down that mating behavior. One thing that we're working on right now that's really exciting, we're working with our climatologist to develop what we call a pest forecast system. Laura kind of touched on that last night if you're here for the climatology session after dinner. But what that is we're using what's called accumulated degree days, and it's just accumulated heat units, similar to what you use to time your crop production, but this is looking at insect production. And the alfalfa weevil in particular is just really predictable. It relies really heavily on the temperatures. You can time when they're going to emerge, when they're going to start laying eggs, when those eggs are going to hatch, and just all these different development times and behaviors you can really kind of cue in on based on these degree days. So the system that we're using is going to be an online system where you can get online, you can select the weather station that's closest to your location, the crop, the pest, and then you get this number that pops up, and that's your accumulated degree days, and then recommendations from there. So we're trying to take that guesswork out. Based on these accumulated degree days, we can see, oh, should I start sampling now? I'm a little early, but I can catch them as they start emerging for the first time. Whoa. Better weight that one down. good tools for our crop advisors and for our producers, just by taking out that guesswork. So with this Western behavior that we see a lot of, you know, you just don't have to use these chemical applications to hit them. There's a lot of different opportunities to use a more, I don't necessarily like the word organic, so we're going to go with naturalist approach. If you're working with producers, or even if you have cattle yourselves and are growing alfalfa, early grazing is just an excellent management strategy. The weevils, they come out, they have to have these nice stems to oviposit eggs in. The stems are the incubators for the eggs. Well, early grazing, you get out and you really just have your cattle or your sheep graze down those stems, keep them short, because we all get that, you know, every year we get that frost. This year in particular, I was working with a lot of guys. We had hay up over our knees. It was gorgeous looking stuff, but you know, they had this twinkle in their eye thinking that, oh, this is going to be the year we're not going to get that frost. I had guys talking about maybe getting a 4th cutting this year just because it was so far ahead on the west side. Well, trying to talk them out of putting all their money into that, or personal investment, getting their hopes up, because we always get that frost that knocks it down. And then your alfalfa spends so much time and energy trying to repair those damaged stems that it kind of delays the regrowth for your first cutting. So by keeping that graze down, you don't have your plant using or wasting energy trying to repair something. You keep the cattle on it, you let them graze, get some good early feed, and then after that frost, you pull them off and they just start shooting back up. And the guys I talked into, I had one that was on the irrigation project. He used his sheep, kept it grazed down, and then I had a rancher that uses cattle on dryland alfalfa, and they kept that grazed down, got good feed, alfalfa sprung right back up, and they actually were able to get a pretty decent first cutting, where other guys that had waited and kind of held out hope that we were missing this frost, their plants were a couple weeks behind trying to recover from, trying to recover those damaged stems before it put out new growth. Well, then they got hit by the heat this year. A lot of people did, where they were having to cut early, the alfalfa got stressed, it blossomed, and so that early grazing is just great for the plant and anyone that's really trying to get kind of ahead of the game. But just not looking at it from a production standpoint, that also eliminates a lot of pest pressure. When those weevils come in from their overwintering sites, they overwinter on these forest lines or in ditches, that just anywhere outside of the field. When they come back in, the first thing they're looking for are these stems. It's going to be a quick food source, and it's mainly their oviposition site. Well, if you have your cattle or sheep that are keeping that really grazed down, you're eliminating that breeding site. So they're going to leave. They're going to find somewhere else. And throughout the season, you're just not going to see the pest pressure. You may not reach threshold. We did reach threshold in one of the locations this year that was doing that early grazing, but then that was a single application, and he didn't see the weevils come back for that second cutting. So there's a lot of really, really good opportunities there to do that. If grazing's not an option, especially out here, early harvest is about as good of a practice as any to manage these weevils. You don't always have to spray for them. If you're growing for nutrient content with the dairies that are out here, West River, we were growing for nutrient content, but the dairies left, so now we're growing for tonnage. Early cutting's not necessarily a good option for that, because you're not going to get the weight out of it. But out here, where nutrients really important for the dairies, early cutting's just a really, really good approach. There's been a lot of studies that show you can drop an alfalfa weevil population and other pest populations by like 90 to 98% just by doing that, because you're eliminating that food source and breeding site and shelter all at once. And if you do have weevils come back for that second cutting, just going out and doing a quick spray on those crowns. There's nowhere for those larvae to hide at that point. They're not going to crawl out of the field. They're just going to sit on the crowns and wait for this new growth to come up, and you can just go out and spray and knock them down, and at that point your job's done. So there are some different aspects than just spraying this alfalfa. If you are going to spray, you really need to be out sampling and monitoring for these weevils. And right now, a lot of the decision making's been based off of sweep netting. I had a really good program lined up. The reason we're not out in the alfalfa is because there are no weevils in it right now. They leave the fields twice. They leave in the winter and they leave in the summer. They're not heat tolerant, and they really don't like it. So I scouted about 4 times out in this area and didn't find any weevils of any kind, and definitely didn't find any other pests. A couple grasshoppers, and that was about it. So if you are gonna start managing and trying to get ahead of these weevils, sampling's got to start with the sweep net. It's by far the cheapest and most effective tool you can have. I mean, 25 bucks and you can just do everything with them. But for these weevils, they're really just an early detection tool. All you're out doing is you're sampling, just looking for one larvae, just that beginning of the egg hatching period. So once you find that egg hatching, you can kind of put the sweep net away. You don't need it anymore. A really good program, I've got it, there it is. A really good program was designed out of University of Kentucky by a professor. And it's all based off of stem sampling. So you go out early in the season with your sweep net, you find that one larvae, put the sweep net away, and then you start collecting stems. And the stem sampling, you know, right away, it may not sound like the greatest thing, but it's faster than sweep netting. You only have to do one sampling site, which is kind of just throughout your field. You just grab 30 random stems throughout the field, throw them in a bucket. When you have all your stems, you go back to the truck, you take average stem height, and, well, before you do that, you gotta kind of take these stems in groups of 4 or 5, and you just beat the hell out of them on these buckets, trying to shake off the larvae. Set those aside, get your average stem height, and then once you have that, you're really gonna have 3 numbers. Accumulated degree days, which is something that we'll be providing next year with our pest forecast system. You're gonna have average stem height, and then you're gonna have the number of larvae per stem. And so you go to these tables, and so let's say we're at 500 degree days. The average stem height's about 14 inches, and you go to the table and you see, all right, well, the threshold's 72 for 16-inch alfalfa. All right, well, I only got 60 alfalfa weevils. Well, based on the tables, you're not at threshold. Just sample in a couple days, and you may not reach threshold. And the plants can handle a lot of weevils, more than just the one. I've worked with a lot of producers that they can't handle one, and so they sprayed 4-6 times. One did spray 6 times last season. You can make money on alfalfa, but you can't make money spraying 6 times. There's just no way. And so using these tables, you take a lot of that management decision out. It's just really simple. Am I at this threshold, at this stem height? Yes or no, and that'll help you decide, all right, do I harvest early at this point, or do I make an application? So this is the program that I'm trying to move a lot of the producers I work with over to. West River, we're kind of behind the times there, so getting them to get out and use a sweep net's been a pretty good work in progress, but they are excited about this just because they don't have to really, it's really easy, it's really quick. You sample your whole field with 30 stems and the decisions are made here. It's just a really good opportunity for them, and this is something I'd really like to see get spread across the state. Moving away just from the alfalfa weevils, a new pest that I'm really starting to see is it's called a blister beetle, if you've heard of that. The blister beetle is both a beneficial insect and it's a really bad pest. They kind of how we're seeing them a lot more these past couple years is they feed on grasshopper eggs. The adults will lay their eggs just on top of grasshopper egg tubes, which we've not been in any short supply of grasshoppers the past few years. So their numbers are these blister beetle numbers are really growing. Well, that's good. They're lowering grasshopper populations, but the problem occurs when these blister beetles emerge as adults. They're really attracted to alfalfa blossoms, have a really strong preference to them. So they'll aggregate in this alfalfa. Well, they're not the only pests that will aggregate in alfalfa, but their problem is they're called a blister beetle for a reason. If you or an animal were to bite down on that, it scalds the insides of horses' mouths. I mean, they literally does blister. I've made the mistake of smashing one between my hand. I was sampling carpenter ants and thought a carpenter ant was crawling across my hand. I smashed it. Oh, it was a blister beetle, and you get these nasty blisters that it's just like scalding your hand with super hot water. And it's oil based, so you got to scrub and try and get that oil out. Otherwise, it just kind of persists in your hand, and it takes a long time to heal. So you can imagine horse or cattle going and feeding on a bale of hay and crunching down on one. Well, they get these big sores in their mouths, and they get food shy. Horses in particular. Cattle aren't the smartest creatures on the earth, but even they're a little hesitant to go back to that bale after it happens. More importantly, if they were to ingest them, horses are really sensitive to these blister beetles, and it can cause colic in both animals and death really quick in horses. Custer, we had a couple incidents last year in Custer. We have these vacationers coming up from Texas that bring their horses and dump them on a few acres, and they're all fed from these bales. Well, they had, I think, 6 horses die last year from these blister beetles, and these are pets. They're not work horses or anything, so when they come out and see Fluffy dead on the ground, they got to figure out what's going on, and they actually paid for autopsies on the horses, which is a little crazy in my book, but you know, if it's a good pet, you might as well find out. And the veterinarian, I got a chance to talk to him, and he said he found 1 blister beetle in 2 of the horse guts. Now, whether they had ingested the oil that was in the hay along with these beetles, he wasn't sure, but 1 blister beetle's kind of a scary thing. So they're starting to come out, and we've had producers that East River or West River, we're seeing a lot of them. The threshold right now in 40 sweeps in your field is 1. I was sweeping earlier this year, sweeping that first cutting, was finding 20 or more. That's scary high numbers. So we had an incident last year where a producer, great producer of alfalfa north of the irrigation project, he had contracts to sell hay over in Wyoming to some horse breeders, killed a couple of their horses. They broke the contract, told no one to buy it, told everyone to buy it, you know, stop buying his hay. And even his neighbors were kind of taking advantage of that and saying, oh, you don't want to buy his hay, it's infested with blister beetles. Well, that worked for about a week until they were infested with blister beetles. So what do we do? Well, spraying. If you're at that high of a number, you can spray them and knock them down. Same sprays work on these blister beetles that work for alfalfa weevils and grasshoppers. But most importantly, the first thing you gotta do is don't crimp your hay. Go out, swath it down, let it dry for a few days. Letting it dry, these blister beetles need moisture. They've got to have something, so when that hay's laying down drying, these beetles are going to go somewhere else. They've got to find a source of a little bit of moisture. So they'll leave the fields, give it a few days, and then you can go and break it up and bale it. You're done from there, no worries. But those crimpers, going out and collecting it and cutting and crimping, you're going to smash those beetles and release this oil-based toxin. That's what's killing the horses, and that's what's blistering mouths and causing the main problem. And since it's an oil base, it's going to persist in hay for about 5 years or more. I don't know many guys willing to hold off feeding their hay for 5 years. So it's a real big concern right now, are these blister beetles. And I was hoping that we'd only be seeing them on the irrigation projects because of the extra moisture that's present. Well, that wasn't the case. Dryland alfalfa has just as much as everywhere else. And I've gotten a few calls and pictures sent from East River, and next year I expect that we're going to be seeing a lot more of them across the state. So it's something to be aware of and keep your eye out for. In particular, it's the ash gray blister beetle. It's a pretty small, inch or less, really narrow blister beetle. Looks a lot like a ground beetle. It's just a really light gray, almost blue color, and they have a really small neck or thorax that it's a lot narrower than the size of their head or their abdomen. So they're pretty easy to see, and they'll stay on the tops of the plants, and you'll find them aggregating on these blossoms. Besides those two guys, next big thing are these grasshoppers. I'm sure we've all been dealing with grasshoppers in one way or another. Kind of my grasshoppers questions quit coming in when the crops all started dying because of this drought. This has kind of been the most damage that I've seen from grasshoppers. Again, I'm West River, so there's not a whole lot of soybeans growing out that direction, but I was expecting to hear a lot of problems coming from the wheat fields and some other crops, but we weren't really seeing them. And grasshoppers in particular, the 5 main species we have that are of concern are the red-legged, the differential, the migratory, the two-stripe, and the Gladstone grasshoppers. Well, they all require, and you can kind of see them if you're on your way out. Take a look. These grasshoppers are still sunning themselves on the tops of their plants. They're not feeding at all. They've got to sun themselves in the morning and kind of warm up, and that increases their rate of metabolism so they can feed a lot more efficiently. Well, that feeding behavior stops at about 95 degrees. They can't do it. It's too hot. They drop from the plants and start collecting in shaded areas. So the grasshoppers, we have a ton of them this year, but they're just not causing the feeding damage that we would be expecting. They're only when it's over 100 every day, there's only about an hour to 2 hour period where they can really feed. And that's lowered a lot of the damage that we've been seeing across the western part of the state. Now, because we've had issues with the drought and crops aren't doing well, no one's really paying the money to go out and spray a dead crop for these grasshoppers, so which is pretty reasonable. But that's going to cause some major problems next year. We don't have that check and balance system like we've had the past few years where everyone's going out and trying to at least put a dent in the population. This year they're kind of running rampant, and that's going to be a big issue come next season. So just be aware of that and try and stay ahead of them a little bit. A really good chemical that's come out is Demolin. It's an insect growth regulator. You have to apply it to the first 3 instars of these grasshoppers, so sampling is really important. It doesn't work on adults. You could dip the adults in it and it's not going to do a darn thing to them. So with that Demolin, there's a program called RATS. It's reduced area and agent treatments, where you're actually using less chemical on less area and getting the same amount of control. Because the grasshoppers are so mobile, you kind of take advantage of that behavior and let them move through treated and untreated areas. And that's been it's a low-cost system to producers, and a couple of studies that were done in 2010 found that it was getting between anywhere from 75 to 96% effectiveness in dropping grasshopper populations, and they were using 20% of the chemicals that they were using and only spraying 40% of the area. Yeah.
Are you recommending strip spraying then?
Yeah, that's how it's done. You can do it aerially or with four-wheelers. And the four-wheeler applicators are really cool because they have these intermittent sprays where it's not a continuous spray. The sprayers are turning on and off really quick, so you're just getting blasts, and they knocked the amount of chemical down. They were using about 40 to 50% of the chemical. They dropped that down to 20% using the four-wheelers in the field, and just got really, really good control with them. It's a very good program to start looking into. Wyoming does it. They're the ones that kind of developed this program, and actually they got everyone to they pick like a week or two during the year and say, all right, the grasshoppers are reaching thresholds fairly often. If you're gonna spray, you're spraying now, like during this short time period. And they really dropped their grasshopper populations because there's nowhere for them to run at that point. You're not having one guy spray and then 3 neighbors that are waiting 2 weeks. As much as we think that the grasshoppers and these other pests are watching the spray boom roll over them, they're not. They're smarter than that. They're moving out of the fields, and they'll feed for a while until they get pushed back into a treated field. So they're pretty clever little insects.